Jeffrey A. Slotnick is an internationally known enterprise security risk consultant with more than 28 years of experience. He's recognized as a thought leader and critical architect in homeland security. As an ISO-credentialed lead auditor, Slotnick's responsible for some of the latest advancements in all hazards disaster resilience, organizational resilience management, standards development, resiliency information management processes, and enterprise security risk management. Slotnick is focused on the professional development and training of security, law enforcement, and military personnel, the provision of exceptional security services, protective services, and all facets of enterprise security risk management. He's the owner of Cetricon, Inc. Jeff, take it away.
Good day, folks, and thank you for joining our session today on quality risk management and auditor's perspective. Just a little bit before we get started, let you know who you're speaking with. We are engaged in the process of enterprise security risk management every day. We specialize in audits around ISO 28000, ISO 31000 risk management, and 22000 business continuity, as well as resilience management systems. We also are engaged in developing and building technology solutions to support our processes and what we do, which is exactly what we're going to be speaking about today. Just a little bit, a couple photographs here so that you can see who I am and who my partner is and what it is that we do. Michael Kniep is our Chief Technical Officer and one of the managing partners, and as I am often fond of saying, I dream it and Michael can build it, which has been a great partnership since 2003. So during our session today, we're going to be discussing several things. We're going to talk about the cost of not leveraging physical security information and information gained from audits. We're going to talk about how that information can be repurposed for value to the enterprise. We're going to talk a bit about data analytics and talk about a strategy to pursue the new opportunity in that regard. A little bit of history. 10 years ago, most of us were just speaking about convergence, and what we mean by convergence is the convergence of systems that were prior to integration, standalone systems, and now are fully integrated into the business backbone and utilize the same internet services, servers, and things that the rest of our business systems do. Those systems were standalone systems. And the process of conducting risk assessment was a standalone process as well. Sorry about that. 5 years ago, we were entrenched in system integration, and we were talking about physical security information management systems. Today, we're speaking about managing data and how we gain value from that data. Specifically, we're going to be speaking about enterprise security risk management and talk about the identification of risk, identifying areas where we can become resilient organizations or helping our clients to become resilient, and reaping the rewards of that resiliency. When you consider risk, you have to consider risk as something that has value. There's lots of great cases throughout history when disaster strikes of what the value of risk is to an enterprise. That value is often reflected in things like revenue stream, loss of public confidence, which means that your products don't sell. In extreme cases with government, it can mean the loss of civil order, the loss of precious life, loss of key personnel and those that have corporate knowledge or institutional knowledge for advancing our businesses. Loss of critical supply chain, very similar to what occurred in Fukushima. A lot of folks are not aware, but the incident that occurred in Fukushima, which was a tsunami and meltdown of a nuclear reactor, actually cost billions and billions of dollars in global supply chain due to a loss of parts and repair parts and manufacturing capability from some critical plants that were sole sourced in the city of Fukushima. Loss of utility that runs our data centers, loss of utility that runs our businesses, hospitals, and so on. Loss of facilities from earthquakes, from windstorms, from terrorist action. Loss of finance and loss of communication systems. And as of lately, very important, loss of IT systems and how our information technology systems can become compromised. All of these have high order of magnitude impacts on any large enterprise organization. So as an auditor, we have to start defining the problem somewhere. This is where we talk about the problem-solving process. And the problem-solving process is common to almost any industry. We have to identify the problem, gather facts, generate options for resolving the problems, evaluate those options and implement them, and then monitor the results. In our industry, as an auditor, we call this process a risk assessment audit. And thereby we can identify the issues and the problems and create the baseline for gathering information that can assist us in developing mitigations for the enterprise that will allow the enterprise to better itself. In the very best of cases, our mitigations will result in the enterprise not being impacted by the potential risks that can affect them. In other cases, they may have a minor effect or certainly an effect where they can absolutely recover from those events. In extreme events where it's something that they have not considered, their practice is so well developed and they're so used to working together and developing risk management solutions that they can take what they've learned from other areas of their practice and apply those to the new problem and resolve situations much, much quicker than they could before. Here's a brief definition of what a vulnerability assessment is. This was developed by Dr. Mary Lynn Garcia of Sandia National Laboratories in her book, The Vulnerability Assessment of Physical Protection Systems. She states, a vulnerability assessment is a systematic evaluation in which quantitative and or qualitative techniques are used to predict physical protection system component performance and overall system effectiveness by identifying exploitable weaknesses in asset protection for a divine threat. Now, that's a very complex subject, and it's a very detailed assessment. But we look at things just a little bit differently. We feel that an audit should be all hazards. In other words, it's not just crime and terrorism. It's environmental health and safety. It's natural disaster. It's accidental issues that occur. It is man-made issues that occur. But a risk assessment is not a one and done. An audit is not something that you do one time and walk away from. It is a systemic evaluation. It's real time, it's persistent and accurate. What makes it real time and persistent is that as we identify issues and we create risk mitigations, when we apply that mitigation, we have to also look at the effectiveness of that mitigation and what the new risk rating is based on the mitigation that we've employed. Otherwise, we cannot show value for our function, and we can't tell whether the enterprise is getting better or worse over time. So a risk assessment is one means, or a risk audit is one means of showing value to the organization for the risk management function. So in our world today, how is it that we accomplish risk assessments? Many folks, they accomplish these audits by utilizing manual business processes and information workflows. For example, it's a written report, generally on a word processor or utilizing Microsoft Word. Information is gathered by taking notes, checklists, photographs that are done on location and incorporated into the report. Programs and assets are generally under contractor management, and it's a very, very difficult process when we look at it from a manual standpoint. And what do we get from that? We get a paper-based product. Oftentimes, we see a report that's 200 to 250 pages long with a 5-page executive summary and 20 pages of mitigations at the end of the report. And the client generally goes ahead and reads the executive summary and reads the mitigations at the end, but doesn't look at all the great information, all the great analytical information that's in the center of the report. We have a tendency to take silos of data. It's human nature to take that data and place it into individual silos. And of course, as a result, we have ill-defined metrics, and we have value that's inherent in these reports that is there, that is unexpressed and unable to be captured. So I would ask you, how do you accomplish risk audits as an audit professional? Are you paper-based? Are you using MS Word, maybe an Excel spreadsheet or checklist, some sort of template or an automated tool? The question you have to ask if you're using an automated tool is, do you own the data, or does somebody else own your data? Are you engaging in what we call assessment by the pound? In other words, you have a very, very large report that is not being utilized, where the data is trapped within the pages of the document. So because of that, we have a lot of lost value leverage. We're not able to look at what other auditors have done. We're not able to understand the learnings that have occurred. The data is rarely repurposed and committed to knowledge in the areas of people, processes, and communication platforms, thereby diluting the essential business process of process improvement efforts, continuous compliance, because many of us are operating in compliance-based industries. And as we gain more data, proactive and predictive response to risks. So if we have a large amount of data that has been captured over time in various operational areas, in various compliance silos, there is information to be learned and information that can be shared that can help us to be proactive and predictive in risks that may appear in the future. Because we are looking at data and information from a data perspective, we're not duplicating infrastructure costs by recreating the report each time we do a report. Some folks are on cycles. Minimum I've seen is every year. Some folks are redoing audits every 2 to 3 years. But why should these be a redo? Why should we start from ground zero and start all over again? We've estimated that by not utilizing technology, that 10 to 20% of the audit spend is based on the inefficiency of people, processes, and tools. We've actually found that when automation is used, when data is applied, when learnings for a persistent process are engaged, that we're actually able to cut 20 to 30% off of the actual time it takes to conduct a risk audit. So case studies. Today we look at assessments, audits, we look at business processes and workflows, all hazards, risk, and situational awareness. In other words, focused on all risk that can impact an enterprise. And what we end up with is a to-be state where information is digitally collected, communicated, and leveraged. We're able to model and test that information, and that information is implemented and measured. We have live streams of data that are correlated against assets within an organization. And we create an environment for continuous compliance and for CQI for programs and contractors. In other words, we have a quality program based in quality techniques, which is exactly what ISO is about, is creating good business processes. So my question to you, how often do you conduct risk assessments? Do you do them annually, biannually? Are they a one and done? When you redo your assessments, are you redoing it from square one, starting over, as if an audit had not been conducted before? Or are you refreshing the old audit to identify whether you're getting better or getting worse? Do you do your audits in-house? Do you have an in-house auditor that you utilize? Are you outsourcing your audits to a consultancy firm, somebody similar to us? Or are you doing a blended audit where you're using in-house and outsourced resources to accomplish your audits in a timely manner? And we also have to ask, how do you manage? You know, it's one thing when you're dealing with an audit for a very small facility, but what about large enterprise assessments where we have organizations with 50, 60 facilities worldwide or more that may have multiple verticals in the same enterprise, in chemical production, in oil and gas, in manufacturing, in food and agriculture, all within the same enterprise? How do you provide a risk snapshot or a risk picture for an organization that size with that many verticals? And what do you do with the information that you gather? Is it trapped in a document? Is it locked somewhere? Is it placed in a cabinet where only certain people can view it? Or is it an absolute operational document that can be processed and consumed over time? Our belief is that all mission-critical enterprise functions, public or private, should deliver the right information at the right time within the right context to create value and mitigate risk. This is essential for any business process. We have to have the information we need to be able to make quality decisions and values-based decisions in the appropriate time allotted. So I would ask you this. Is your risk assessment mission critical? Is the audit you're performing critical to your enterprise? Or is it just something you do? If it is mission critical, does your audit provide the right information so that other business leaders in the C-suite can understand enterprise risks and the opportunities that are provided by those risks? There's oftentimes opportunity in identifying risk and understanding what risks that may be faced by our competitors. When we can show value for what we do, when we are prepared, when our enterprise is functioning when the others are not, then that is a strong value statement that we can make for conducting an audit properly. So the true value of a risk assessment is the ability to maximize the results of a traditional audit and place it in a form that we can obtain information and intelligence from the audit to drive the value proposition for security systems, personnel, and other risk mitigations. We have a method to engage our folks and engage our other members of the executive suite to show value for the security department, for the audit department, and align those departments with enterprise goals. We have to ensure that our risk strategies are linked to the strategies of the enterprise to ensure the enterprise success. This is a photograph of W. Edwards Deming. For those of you that may not be aware, he was an amazing industrialist. And he's the forerunner of continuous quality improvement. And one of his strong statements is that continuous improvement requires that good data be collected. If we don't have the appropriate knowledge, if we're not collecting the appropriate data in our audits, how can we tell if business processes, and in this case our risks, are getting better or worse? It's very, very important that we follow these essential business processes. Now, this is not anything new. This is old school management, dates back to the 1940s and 1950s. But it's equally applicable today, in today's world, in how we conduct our audits. So I want to introduce you, as we transition here, to a new way of thinking. I want you to view your assessment, view your audit as data points. I want you to consider quantifying, ranking, and analyzing the data that we receive. And I want you to be able to portray the data for risk-related business decisions. And understand that our data is subject to analytics over time. There's amazing depth of knowledge in analytics when we know what to pull from and we know what data is there to operate with. So what are the data points for an audit? We need to know the nature of the threat, whether that's man-made, natural, or technological. We need to know what the levels of those threats are by a facility, by a region, or a compliance vertical within our organization. We need to know what compliance requirements are, because the compliance requirements for food and agriculture are very different from healthcare or from oil and gas production. And those compliance requirements are often determined by a particular ISO standard or by an industry standard. We have to be able to look at our data and create a data point for measure of loss and measure of consequence by type and impact. And measure of loss, as I explain it to people, is your pain, and your consequence is the impact of that pain. So those loss measures that we looked at the beginning are very, very applicable as measures of loss, and that measure of loss is different for every client, for every audit. And we also come across different types of measures of loss from time to time. We recently were working with a bus company, and in order for them to stay operational, that bus company needed to have 80% of their buses on the road at any one time. If 80% of their coaches were not mission capable, then there's a significant loss of revenue, and they cannot maintain their commitment to the traveling public that depends on their services. In order to keep that 80% level, there is specific bus maintenance that needs to occur on a coach. That maintenance needs to be performed regularly. You can't just take a large passenger coach and jack it up with a little car jack. It requires a very, very specialized lift system. This organization had 11 such lifts. If they lost more than 3 lifts in an earthquake or were damaged for some other reason, then they would not be able to manage maintaining that 80% threshold that they required to be mission capable. This was a very, very unique measure of loss for a client. It's not one that we had dealt with before. So for them, a measure of loss was maintaining 80% functionality of their 11 lifts. If they lost more than 3 lifts, they were not mission capable. If they had all 11 lifts, they were capable. 10, they were moderate. And we helped them to develop a mitigation. The long-term solution was to build more lifts in additional facilities over time. The short-term mitigation was to contract with other bus companies in the area that were contract bus companies that could provide them with lifts and maintenance facilities to keep their vehicles running. We also want to look at vulnerability by type and impact. So if a loss occurs, what is the impact and how does it make us vulnerable as an organization? We need to look today in something that we've never considered before, which is physical security network architecture. Our access control systems, video systems, visitor management systems, barrier systems, all are part of the Internet of Things today, and understanding their network architecture can also help us to understand their vulnerabilities and how they can be used to breach our enterprise, to gain access to business systems, or to create a denial of service where our physical security systems are simply rendered incapable. We need to look at integration mapping to identify where there may be opportunities for future improvement. Many facilities today utilize guard forces. There's specific metrics that we can use for guard and police forces to measure their efficacy. We have to be able to measure policies, procedures, and plans by type and effectiveness. As we know, a policy and procedure is only as good as the paper it's written on, to the time that it is practiced, and the commitment that's made to that plan in the form of drills and operational exercises. And then, of course, one other data point is risk mitigation strategy effectiveness. This is the persistence that we were speaking about earlier, is the ability to identify a potential risk, apply a risk mitigation to it, develop a strategy for employment of that mitigation, and then evaluating as to whether our mitigation has been effective or not. These are some of the data points that we can consider in a risk, threat, and vulnerability assessment. So understand that when we're looking at the data that's accumulated through a risk assessment, when we look at it from a data perspective, when we look at our audits from a data perspective, performance is measured over seconds and accumulated over time. There's lots and lots of data out there. There's all kinds of data, and it can be overwhelming to a certain point. But it's not something that we can look at and see a benefit from within a day. Sometimes it's a year or 2 years over time that allows us to collect the baseline data to determine whether things are getting better or getting worse and how our performance is doing in this critical business functional area. So let's talk about the data waterfall. Metrics are hidden in the data that you collect every day. In most cases, that data is not being used. It's data that is collected from various systems, whether it's an access control system or a visitor management system or an audit system. It's the forms that contain information in forms of serious incident reports, operational procedure reports, and things like that. It is the analytics that we can apply to those reports to correlate them. One of the things that we frequently talk about is, in the world of access control, is we have one access control that governs our information technology systems. We have another access control system which governs our entrance into a structure. What if we could combine those two access control systems into a single pane of glass? In other words, when I'm looking at the screen, if somebody attempts to log into my network that hasn't logged into my building, and we understand that this particular individual doesn't have permission to access the system from outside the building, then we know we have a potential breach in progress, and we can immediately shut down any data and protect the data of our enterprise and prevent a information technology breach. Also, from the analytics that we create, we can develop various forms of intelligence reports and identify issues that are systemic and endemic to our enterprise to allow us to make great changes that lead to a stronger future and a resilient enterprise. Once we have all this information, we're able to take action that leads to continuous quality improvement and improvement of the enterprise over time in preventing risk and impact from risk. So let's talk about some of the silos where data is hiding and that we don't utilize. There's IP and brand protection silos, intellectual property, investigations that are conducted within the enterprise, ethics regulations, regulatory compliance by vertical, risk management and occupational safety and health issues, business continuity, physical security, loss prevention, fraud prevention, information security systems and background checks. How often these systems are not connected and these systems aren't brought together. So how do we start moving that information forward? It starts with a commitment. Having an executive sponsor, an enterprise risk management executive manager, the resources and capital to proceed, and identifying the integrated roles and responsibilities. We then get into a very important part, which is definition and analysis. And this is where the auditor plays a very strong role. The sponsors identify the scope, objective, and targets. It is up to the auditor to review those, to make suggestions, to actually conduct the risk audit and the business impact analysis, and look at all functional operational risk to the enterprise. From that, we're able to develop standards, policies, or processes, the technology and tools that are needed, and most importantly, awareness, prevention, mitigation, response, and recovery capability. Once we've identified that and we've formed it into plans, we can actually implement and start looking to see how our risk impact analysis and the plans that have resulted from that and the risk mitigation turn into our operating environment in the form of procedures, training, education, persistent communication between various operational entities within the enterprise, and persistent measures for recording data, for reporting information, and of course, resource and finance alignment within the organization. And then as well, with continuous improvement, we evaluate and we review through exercises, simulations, additional audits, and application of corrective actions, which are risk mitigations, and how those mitigations are applied, thereby resulting in a process improvement roadmap and great exceptional planning that will help the organization and the enterprise to advance. So here's the opportunity. It's very important to have an organization that is willing to partner on risk audits to create the data for your business cases. Without the data, as we said earlier, we don't know if things are getting better or worse. It's impossible to make the business case for risk mitigations if we haven't identified the risk in the first place. We have to train our employees on the conduct of assessments, audits, and surveys. That makes them more effective and more efficient in contributing the data that the auditor requires in order to perform a quality assessment. We have to educate our clients on a new way of thinking, because when our enterprise becomes more resilient through this audit process, it actually bodes well for our clients, for our investors, for our stakeholders. Essentially what we're doing is we're adding business process to the business of security and the business of audits. Keep in mind, this is focusing on ISO's 28,000 and 31,000 security management and risk management. That concludes my comments for today. I hope that this has been meaningful to you and that you were able to take some information away. I want to thank you for your time today. If I can be of further assistance to you, please feel free to reach out to Exemplar Global or to myself. And I'd like to thank Exemplar Global for the opportunity today to speak at the International Auditor Symposium in a web-based format. Thank you very much for your time, and have a great rest of the day.
This ends today's presentation. Thanks for attending.